Well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so let's get it started, get you introduced. Good evening, and welcome to Copperfield's Books virtual event with Dr. Jen Gunter. My name is Jamie Madsen, and I'm the Marketing and Events Coordinator here at Copperfield's Books, and I'll also be your host for the evening. Copperfield's Books has been committed to literature, education, and creating community together since our founding in 1981. So just a couple items to note before we get started. I will be using the chat box just to provide links for upcoming Copperfield's events, details for tonight's title. I'll also be including a 10% discount code. So just be on the lookout for that. And the Q&A box will be your go-to with any questions or comments for the speaker. The format will feature around 30 to 45 minutes of speaking and will then be open to a live Q&A. So if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see the icon that says Q&A. Go ahead as your questions and comments arise, just submit there. Thanks. So without further ado, I'm excited to introduce tonight's author, Dr. Jen Gunter. Jen is an internationally best-selling author, obstetrician, and gynecologist with more than 3 decades of experience as a vulvar and vaginal diseases expert. Her New York Times bestseller, The Vagina Bible, has been translated into 19 languages, and The Guardian calls her the world's most famous and outspoken gynecologist. The recipient of the 2020 NAMS Media Award from the North American Menopause Society, she is a columnist for the New York Times and the star of Jensplaining, a CBS video series that highlights the impact of medical misinformation on women. So she's with us tonight on Pub Day. The book just dropped. I'm really excited for her to discuss the new title, The Menopause Manifesto, Own Your Health with Facts and Feminism. So with that, Dr. Jen, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you.
Wow, well, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here. I wish, we could be up in person, but that's okay. We've found all kinds of new creative ways to connect online. So this is the book, The Menopause Manifesto, which, I was working on deep during the pandemic. And I have to say that was really an act of really an effort to really, get your thoughts down on paper. But it gave me a lot of chance to really kind of reflect on medicine in general and where we are now and how we communicate, because a lot of our problems, not all of the problems, but a lot of problems at the beginning of the pandemic were related to poor communication about medicine or misinformation. And so those threads actually became even more prominent in the book because it was so evident as to sort of what was going on communication wise. So this book came about because when I was on tour for the Vagina Bible, which came out a couple of years ago, at every stop, every place I went to talk, people had questions about menopause. They wanted to know about what the advice they've been given or where to get advice, where they were suffering. And something that one woman said in particular really stuck with me, that there was no culture for menopause. There was no sort of society. There was just sort of this absence of discourse, and many women just felt so alone. And it's true that not everybody has bad symptoms, but menopause does increase the risk of many medical conditions. And so it is important for everybody to know about it, whether they have symptoms or not. But I also, in addition to sort of tackling, how to get help when you're suffering or how to be in charge of your health, I really wanted to sort of take a deeper dive into this idea of this lack of sort of belonging or community, or just not understanding menopause, where it is in the history. Why do we have it? It's interesting, most of us, if you ask somebody on the street, why do you have puberty? Most people say, oh, well, we have to reproduce, otherwise, that's it. We're not going to be here anymore. And so, menopause actually has an important role in perpetuation of the species and has been really important in evolution. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So I wanted people to understand the language of menopause, where it came from evolutionary wise, where it fits in our history as humans, and well as the science and how to be in charge of your health. Because for a very long time, meaning I think since the beginning of time, the language that we've used about menopause has really been a language of derision or dismissal, right? We use words like ovarian failure for menopause, but we don't use those words for, we say erectile dysfunction. We have nice euphemisms for that, right? So much of the language around menopause cycles or revolves around really pejorative terminology. And this actually isn't that uncommon in gynecology, which is something that I really feel needs to be changed. For example, the word pudendum, which is something that we often use to describe the vulva or in the area between the vulva and the anus, is from the Latin root is to shame. It's the word is literally from shame, and that has to change. That's not okay to use terminology like that. And so we see a lot of that with menopause, and that also has to change. So I'm going to do a little bit of reading from the book, and then talk about these sections and why they're important to me, or why I felt it was really important to have them in the book. And then in about 20-25 minutes, we'll open it to questions, and we'll see where that goes. Okay, so I'm going to start with the very beginning. It's always a good place to start. The manifesto. If menopause were on Yelp, it would have 1 star. This establishment has temperature control issues. Drenching heat followed by terrible chills. Defies the laws of thermodynamics. Would not recommend. Awful, awful, awful. Bleeding was scheduled, but was rebooked without notification, so arrived 3 weeks later than expected while I was in an Uber and I flooded the car. The driver gave me a terrible review. The sex was dry. And it's no surprise. Most women have no idea what to expect when they are no longer expecting a period. And it's uniquely awful and disempowering to not understand what is happening to your body and why. Menopause is like a canoe trip with no guidebook and only a vague idea of where you're headed. Although the expectation is it's awful. There will be no advice on how to get there or how to manage any of the obstacles, such as rapids. That is, if any exist. Who knows? How figuring it out. Good times. Oh, and don't write. No one wants to hear about your journey or what it was like when you arrived. Fear, check. Uncertainty, check. Medical ramifications, check. Unpleasant symptoms, check. Societal irrelevance, check. No wonder menopause receives such awful reviews. The culture of silence about menopause in our patriarchal society is something to behold. Menopause doesn't even rate the shame that society gives to the vulva and vagina. Apparently, there is nothing of lower value than an aging woman's body. And many in our society treat menopause not as a phase of life, but rather as a phase of death, sort of a pre-death. What little that is spoken about menopause is often viewed through the lens of ovarian failure. The assertion that menopause is a disease that exists because women and their ovaries are weak. The only grounds for this claim are that men don't experience menopause. But comparing women and men in this way is the same as comparing the liver with the heart. The liver isn't weak or diseased because it doesn't beat like the heart, and women aren't diseased because the ovaries stop making estrogen. The absence of menopause from our discourse leaves women uninformed, which can be disempowering, frightening, and makes it difficult to self-advocate. Consequently, many suffer with symptoms or don't receive important health screenings or therapies because they've been dismissed with platitudes like, that's just part of being a woman, or it's not that bad. But the issues with menopause even go beyond these gaps and the medical neglect. Women tell me that menopause is lonely, that there are no stories or culture. And so there is no whisper network that to take up the slack from medicine, nothing to offer comfort. But many women are desperate to know more about menopause so they can understand how and why their body is changing. And they want information so they can make decisions that work for them. They also want to talk about what's happening to their body. I contrast these experiences with my own. having started medical school when I was 20 years old and my OBGYN training when I was 24, I can't remember back to a time when I didn't have a detailed understanding of the hormonal changes of both the menstrual cycle and menopause, and not just the biology, but how to apply it practically to my own body. I never once thought, wow, that is unexpected, or why am I sweating so much everywhere at the age of 45? Or what is going on? Why am I bleeding everywhere? My medical knowledge didn't prevent me from having menopausal acne, hot flushes, or those special heavy periods that are typical of the menopause transition. But because I knew exactly what was happening and when to seek care, it made the whole process feel routine because I knew the tests that were indicated and those that were not. And because I understood the medicine, it was much easier for me to navigate the treatment options and choose the safest, most effective therapy and avoid the snake oil. And that's really what I'm hoping that this book will do for women and really for everyone, because everybody should know about menopause. People go into menopause really just not understanding anything about the biological changes. And so when you're caught in the middle of it, that's sometimes a difficult time to decide what you want to do. But if you know what to expect going into it, things are much less frightening. And there's actually data that shows that when women know more about what's happening to their body, they are less bothered by their symptoms, because being worried on top of having a symptom can make that symptom worse. It's kind of like pouring gasoline on a fire. So knowing the basics is really crucial. And thinking about how we don't know the basics. I mean, when people do learn about reproductive biology in school, they really learn it in a framing of preventing pregnancy. And it's all sort of in a very sort of purity culture. You learn about ovulation, you learn about menstruation, mostly in servitude to not getting pregnant, right? That is, if there's, even talk about sex at all. But we don't teach the full scope of reproductive biology. I mean, we don't explain what happens on the other end. And, just like puberty is a change and a transition, so is the transition into menopause. And there's no reason why you shouldn't know about it at an early age. So you can plan, for example, contraception decisions that you make or decisions about your medical care can actually affect your menopause. So even if you're 20 or 25, knowing is important. But knowing is important just because knowledge is power and allows people to advocate for themselves. So that's a bit of the introduction. Okay, so now let's see where we are here. My flags. Okay. All right. So I want to define menopause for everybody, because I think that's important thing. You know what? There's probably people sitting there thinking, really, what's the menopause transition? What does she mean by that? What's premenopause? What's perimenopause? So many words. So let's talk a little bit about that. So what is menopause? The word has nothing to do with men. It was conceived in 1812 by Dr. Charles Desjardins, a French physician who started with the word menopause, a combination of menes, from the Greek for month, and pausi, from the Greek for cessation, a common term that was used for that phase of life. In 1821, Desjardins updated the term to menopause, and then somewhere along the way, the accent was dropped in the medical literature. Menopause occurs when there are follicles in the ovary capable of ovulating, meaning there are no more eggs. The average age when this happens is 50 to 52 years. One of the defining features is the dramatic drop in estrogen levels, as the follicles are the main source of estrogen. It's the drop in estrogen that causes many of the symptoms and medical concerns unique to menopause. However, there's new research that suggests other hormonal changes that we'll discuss later are also important. Medically speaking, the menopause transition is the time leading up to the final menstrual period. And the final menstrual period marks menopause. And everything after is postmenopause. And it's not possible to know which period is the final one until, well, it's final. And menopause is formally confirmed 12 months after the final menstrual period. So the menopause transition is what leads you up to the final period. That's synonymous with premenopause. Perimenopause is the menopause transition plus 1 year after the final period. And postmenopause is anything after the final period. And I know that sounds a little bit confusing, and medically we don't use premenopause or menopause anymore. We use menopause transition and we use postmenopause. But it's fair to describe the whole experience as menopause. And the reason for that is the final menstrual period is actually a minor player in this. When the final period doesn't mark when symptoms start, it doesn't mark when your risk for medical conditions increases. It's really just something to help us guide whether or not you can get pregnant, and also helps us decide if you have bleeding in the postmenopause, how to manage that. Because symptoms start in the menopause transition, or for some people, they can start after the final period, referring to the whole thing as menopause really takes the heat off the final period. And I think that's really important because a lot of women are told that they can't be having symptoms because they're not yet, they haven't yet had their final period. And that's just not true. So sort of referring to the whole thing more as a continuum and just sort of in menopause, I think is a lot easier for people seeking care. Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about some interesting backstory, or things that I find are interesting from a backstory standpoint. Okay, let me get to the page here. So I want to talk about some of the history of menopause and some of the medical writing. And this was something that I really enjoyed. I ended up with a fairly large collection of textbooks from the 1800s because I really wanted to understand the words that were used, to sort of take a deep dive into the culture of menopause. I really wanted to understand the writings and how people were talking about it, because actually, a lot of it hasn't, it's summarized poorly in the medical literature. So my house is filled with these musty old books. It's amazing what you can find on Etsy, and a variety of sort of used book sites. So that was a really sort of interesting pursuit. And now I have this sort of like old library of these old books. So it's really interesting. So the first mention in Western medical literature of symptoms that we can identify today as related to menopause is in 1582. Dr. Jean Lebeau, a French physician, described petits rouges, or small reds, what today we would call hot flushes, that typically occurred in the face and often ended in moisture, or profuse sweating. These words are really no different from what I might hear in the office today. Dr. Lebeau was a specialist in women's diseases and the physician of Catherine de Bourbon, the sister of Henry IV, King of France, supporting the concept that patronage plays a role in medical discoveries. However, Lebeau was also ahead of his time in many ways. He wrote that a woman is not an imperfect male. He was against forced marriages for women, believed that menstrual discharge was blood, not toxic fluid, and described bloating before menstruation, meaning the first reporting of premenstrual syndrome, and believed that pleasure during sex was important for women as well as men. He was married to Nicole Estia, who wrote the manifesto, The Woes of the Married Woman, an indictment of the institution of marriage and men, and whether their union was happy or not is beyond the scope of this book. While Lebeau was clearly a medical Renaissance man with his observations about women's health, most physicians of the day were hampered by their belief that women were an inferior version of men, as well as by their lack of knowledge of female anatomy and a complete lack of understanding of menstruation. Although the loss of menstruation with age was expected, it was blamed for most ailments that affected women after their final menstrual period. Menstrual blood was considered toxic, the cause of a vast array of illnesses, from miscarriages to cancer to consumption to rabies. Menstrual blood could also kill plants and ruin mirrors. Women's health worsened as they aged because they became too feeble to expel this toxic substance, so it accumulated in the body. I think this is an important point, that if you view the female body as inferior, if you view it as inherently damaged, which is what was the belief from basically the beginning of recorded Western medicine, they believed that women were overly moist. Our tissues were literally too moist, and that menstruation was part of a way to get rid of that excess fluid. Some physicians believed that during pregnancy, that fluid backed up and became breast milk. Obviously that, the knowledge of the day, you can't judge people by that, but understanding that if your whole society, if your belief is that women are inferior, it's pretty easy to make your medicine fit that, right? And so before menopause, everything was to do with your uterus, right? So if you had a pain in your shoulder, it was because of your uterus. If you had a toothache, well, you better vaginal steam to treat your uterus. So everything revolved around that. And it's really fascinating to read a lot of these sort of, old texts that have been transcribed. And it's really all about the uterus. If you're a man and you have pain in your right side and you're 60 and your pain is worse after eating, well, it's
Sorry, everyone. Yes, everyone else's screen froze. I'm not sure what happened, but we're gonna try and get Dr. Jen to re-log in. I don't know if any of you were here in the beginning. She said she has the worst luck with technology, and it's just kind of funny that that would happen right in the middle. Yes, Janice, or I think I might have said your name wrong. Okay, well, I will be right back. Oh,
you're back.
yay! We were just laughing about how you warned us about your relationship with technology.
It's so strange. It's so amazing. And all of a sudden it just crashes. I'm like, oh, maybe it was the internet. It wasn't the internet. It just zoomed, just crashed. I'm telling you, I have this ability.
Well, I'm glad you're back. So continue on.
Oh my gosh, I swear. Maybe I need to be working in electrical fields or something. It's really quite astonishing, this ability. Oh my gosh. I was talking about the storied history of hormones and other treatments for menopause. So I devote several chapters to that in the book. The factual information about menopausal hormone therapy, where it came from, also what's available today. I talk a lot about so-called menoceuticals, so supplements that are promoted. There's a lot of information in here about how hormones are actually made, because the people that promote compounded hormones basically are lying about their products or are not giving people the full information. And so all of that is actually in the book, what you need to know, and what you need to know to sort of pick up on the snake oil that might be out there. But the history of the origins of menopausal hormone therapy, I think it's really interesting, and there's some very funny chapters or interesting chapters. So I'm going to read you a little bit about that. But before I start, I want to say that we used to call it HRT, hormone replacement therapy, but that implies that you're replacing something that should be there. And if you are menopausal, you shouldn't have estrogen, meaning evolutionarily speaking, right? This isn't like having a dysfunctional thyroid gland, where if you don't have enough thyroid hormone, that is a medical problem. Not every person needs estrogen in their menopause. And so to call it a replacement is really not accurate. And so we now use the term menopausal hormone therapy. And I think that is far more accurate, because it's a therapy. It can be a therapy that can be helpful for some people and not helpful for others. And it's important to use accurate terminology. And this is sort of it's going to be a thread throughout, because it's very easy to twist words and also have them mean things that they don't. And so everybody's on the same page. We're saying menopausal hormone therapy. And that is the new accepted language. Okay, but let's talk about the origins of menopausal hormone therapy. So the first documented use of menopausal hormone therapy was in 1887, when Dr. Hubert Fosbury used an ovarian extract to treat Mrs. C. I think this is really interesting. In old case reports or old medical journals up until, I don't know, maybe the 1930s, 1940s, but this was, I pulled the original article from 1887. You can find everything online. They always refer to the patient just as like Mrs. C or Mrs. G or Mrs. X. So just so you know. So when Dr. Hubert Fosbury used an ovarian extract to treat Mrs. C, a 52-year-old woman with hot flushes, Mrs. C had been subject to all manner of awful 19th century remedies for heavy periods, such as arsenic, ergot, ground thyroid gland, potassium bromide, and twice daily plugging of her vagina, alternating with iced douches. Yeah. When her periods finally stopped, she was probably like, oh my God, thank you. When her periods finally stopped, she had frequent and violent flushing. When standard therapies failed, which sometimes even included lead, by the way, an ovarian extract was administered. And by the third day, she was feeling better. 3 weeks later, she was cured, requiring only occasional doses thereafter to keep her symptoms at bay. The hypothesis of an ovarian extract for hot flushes was based on sound evidence. Removing the ovaries was known to cause symptoms of menopause, and animal studies had shown the effects of castration could be reversed by transplanting ovaries from another animal. However, interpreting Mrs. C's results as anything more than placebo isn't possible. Resolving hot flushes is impressive, although not impossible. Considering she was treated orally, the amount absorbed would likely have been negligible, as pharmaceutical modifications are typically needed to improve absorption and achieve therapeutic levels in the blood. Oral estrogens also need to be given daily to maintain levels, so Mrs. C's dosing herself every few weeks seemed unlikely to be successful, even if any estrogen were absorbed. It's also worth noting that her violent flushing could have been a side effect of the therapies used to try to stop her bleeding, such as the ergotamine, the thyroid hormone in the gland, or arsenic poisoning, or possibly a combination of all three. Regardless, the idea of treating menopausal symptoms with ovarian extract was introduced to the medical world. And by 1899, formulations for powdered cow ovary called Ovarin were commonly available. Most often, the powder was placed into capsules or flavored with vanilla. Apparently, the taste of cow ovaries was unpleasant. The first hormone was identified in the early 1900s, and then the search was on to identify reproductive hormones. Researchers began injecting extracts of ovary, placenta, and amniotic fluid into castrated rats and mice to look for an effect on tissues, thereby proving that these extracts had hormones. Although reproductive hormones had yet to be identified, that they likely existed led to a variety of different therapies. And by the 1920s, various extracts were used for symptoms of menopause. An extract from the corpus luteum of the ovary, which we know today produces progesterone, it proved to be ineffective. Amniotin, which was made from the amniotic fluid from fetal cattle, and theolin, an extract from the follicular fluid from hog ovaries. Amnion and theolin were apparently moderately successful. And these were the products that were actually in use for quite some time until estrogen was actually identified and then could be purified. And I find it really interesting that a lot of advocates of so-called compounded therapies like to say that, or make claim that, the pharmaceutical industry took over hormones, that before then, I don't know what, they never actually finished the sentence, but that before big pharma got involved, things were great. Well, they weren't. They were injections of hog ovary fluid, which would have produced wild swings in hormone levels and were actually very expensive to produce. And so this idea that these substances, in the 1920s were somehow some great product that was replaced by big pharma, they weren't being distilled by women in their backyards. They were being made by, yes, pharmaceutical companies. In fact, I was able to secure a vial of theolin from the 1920s. It's amazing what you can find on Etsy. And it was made by Park Davis. So I think it's just really important to be accurate about where these things come from. So now I want to talk a little bit more about some of the medical research that led to the identifying hormones. So another issue with this first therapeutic hormones, the theolin and amniotin and things that I discussed, was the availability of the raw product and the effort it took to isolate the estrogen. So once we knew it was estrogen, they could take hog ovary fluid, take fluid and extract the estrogen from it. Because there was still no way to synthesize hormones, meaning making them in a lab. So they were extracted from the urine of pregnant women, because high levels of estrogen spill into the urine during pregnancy, or from animals. And these estrogens were natural chemicals, meaning they were obtained by extraction from a natural source, remaining unchanged by the process. Think boiling salt water for the salt. The salt was always there. Boiling the water didn't just remove the water and didn't alter the salt. Extracting natural estradiol and estrone, the two estrogens that were used, from urine, amniotic fluid, and hog ovaries was, as one might expect, consuming and expensive. It was about $300 a gram at the time, and large volumes of raw product for a small amount of usable material. So much urine was needed that one of Dr. Doisy, and he was the man who first identified estrogen, one of Dr. Doisy's assistants was transporting jugs of urine from a prenatal clinic to their lab when he was stopped by the police. This was during Prohibition, and the volume and the color of the liquid in the containers made the police suspect he was a bootlegger. I imagine the officer was quite surprised when he smelled the contents of the containers. So yes, so they were literally driving around to prenatal clinics getting masses and masses and masses of urine from pregnant women to distill the estrogen, which obviously was super expensive and time consuming, and also, probably not a super pleasant process. But considering, the technology that they had, it's really amazing what they achieved. So that's a little bit about that. Now I want to talk a little bit about some non-pharmaceutical therapies as well. So this idea that that there have been, historically great treatments for hot flushes, known to sort of women and not to the medical society is really not true. There's almost every sort of herbal concoction that has been recommended historically for these, for menopause has been tested or shouldn't be tested because it's dangerous. For example, pennyroyal was in many of the ancient treatments from the 1700s, 1800s, and it's a highly toxic herb. Is from the mint family that is, either universally fatal or causes liver failure. So, you definitely don't want to take pennyroyal. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of what I would call sort of supplements as the new patent medicines. So this history of patent medicines is really fascinating. How supplements were sold to people in the 1800s as treatments. These were before we had a lot of medical care. And there's a really interesting history of a certain patent medicine in the United States that was incredibly popular, and I want to go through it. So. Propriety elixirs and concoctions have been around for a long time. They were originally called nostrum remedium, our remedy in Latin, eventually becoming known as nostrums. The term patent medicine comes from products that found favor with royalty and were subsequently issued a royal letter or patent as endorsement. They were heavily advertised with wild claims and patient testimonials, exactly like many supplements today. Patent medicines were popular in the 1800s. It's understandable why women approaching menopause turned to them, as many medical therapies of the day were crude and ineffective at best. Common prescriptions were bloodletting. They did bloodletting for everything. And this gets back to the idea that they felt that women were too moist, the tissue was too moist. And so since your periods had stopped, you weren't getting rid of that toxic fluid. So that's why you needed bloodletting. Leeches to the vulva, purgatives, sudorifics, that's stuff to make you sweat, sedatives, belladonna, and vaginal injections with a solution of acetate of lead. Even removing the ovaries was recommended, even though mortality from the surgery was high. Advertisements for patent medicines were aimed specifically at women. The same product was typically recommended for almost every medical condition, from uterine prolapse to infertility to missed periods, often code for pregnancy, and hence the insinuation the product could induce an abortion and to menopause. Some contain pennyroyal, which I mentioned earlier, an extract from an herb in the mint family that has long been used as an abortifacient. It's highly toxic and shouldn't be taken in any dose. While it may induce uterine contractions, side effects are liver failure and death. Other common ingredients in these elixirs were quinine, boric acid, and oil of theobroma, which you might know as cocoa butter. Yes, some patent medicines contain chocolate. One of the most successful patent medicines was Lydia Pinkham's vegetable compound for ailments peculiar to women. And it was specifically geared towards the change of life or menopause. According to Rainey Horowitz, who took a deep dive into Lydia Pinkham and her vegetable compound for the Embryo Project Encyclopedia, it's well worth a read. Lydia Estes Pinkham invented this concoction of alcohol roots and herbs in her kitchen in 1873 in Lynn, Massachusetts. Pinkham started small, but as requests increased, her business expanded. The product was heavily advertised as a woman's cure for women's ills and could apparently do all of the following: give quick relief and effect a permanent cure in all cases of irregularity, faintness, headache, chlorosis, megrims, displacements, periodic bearing down pains, dizziness, palpitations, depression, pains in the back, and those dull and listless days where you feel fit for nothing. Chlorosis is anemia or low blood count, and megrims is low spirits, displacements is prolapse, and the bearing down pain, I suspect, is menstrual cramps. This was gynecology in a bottle. And yes, if something sounds good to be true, it is. We now know all of these conditions are caused by vastly different biological processes, and there isn't one therapy to rule them all. Pinkham's original recipe included black cohosh, life root, unicorn root, pleurisy root, and fenugreek seed. The black cohosh was apparently the ingredient for menopausal symptoms. The original recipe contained alcohol, although this wasn't disclosed for many years. And I'd just like to add a little bit about black cohosh, which I also cover elsewhere in the book. It has been studied, isn't effective for menopausal symptoms. And it's often promoted as such under the guise that it was used by Native Americans. And this is a really common trope that we see in alternative medicine, this sort of idea that if it was in another culture in ancient time or historical time, then it can be easily translated to our days. And, you know, that is Western exoticism, really, of other cultures. And actually, Native Americans did not use black cohosh for menopausal symptoms. So it's accurate. They used it in pregnancy, but not for menopause. So the original recipe contained alcohol, although this wasn't disclosed for many years. Pinkham's vegetable compound was tested in 1911, and the results were published in the British Medical Journal. It was 19.3% alcohol, which is the same alcohol content of most port wine for reference. I know, right? There was no evidence of any active substance identified. So I decided to perform a trial of a home version of Pinkham's tonic. Well, the alcohol part, I wanted to see if 30 milliliters, 1 tablespoon of 19.3% alcohol every 4 hours, the dose of the supposedly inactive ingredient in Pinkham's vegetable compound might improve a dull and listless day when I felt fit for nothing. I chose a good quality port with a 19.5% alcohol content. Look, I wasn't going to drink nasty port before my coffee. Between the COVID-19 pandemic and the smoke-filled skies of California's fire season, it wasn't hard to find a day when I felt fit for nothing. So one Sunday morning, I began with a shot of port after brushing my teeth and continued to dose myself regularly until bedtime. For science, let's just say it smoothed the day a little, and no, I'm not recommending it as therapy. Clearly, there was an active ingredient, just not the one advertised. And actually, we see that today. A lot of, so-called herbal remedies actually are really just alcohol. And so it's important to point that out. And finally, I think, we should be opening this up to questions. I just want to end with the last paragraph from the book. Many women have been conditioned to fear menopause as an expiration date for relevance and as a sign of weakness, only because that is what men thought. In fact, we have this amazing data that tells us menopause is the opposite, a time when historically women contributed great things to society because of their knowledge and age. That's actually the grandmother hypothesis, which I cover in detail in the book, that we have menopause for a reason. Yes, menopause has symptoms and is associated with medical concerns, but there is help, and it's certainly not a premorbid state. When told by a patriarchal society, the story of menopause is one about deserted youth, frailty, and diminished worth. The story I want you to remember is about value, agency, and voice, and the knowledge to keep yourself in the best of health while demanding an equal seat at the table. That is my manifesto. And so I think I've spoken enough, and I don't want to certainly risk another collapse of the Zoom system. And so I'd like to open it to any questions.
That was fantastic. And wow, some of those facts are like really inhumane. I really look forward to reading more about it in the manifesto. Tons of feedback. People are loving it. And we do have quite a few questions. So are you ready to dive in?
Sure.
Okay. John is wondering, on page 51 of the Menopause Manifesto, you mentioned lavender as an endocrine disrupting chemical. Mm-hmm. We grow lavender and use it very occasionally in recipes. Should we have a concern?
No. So, the amount of lavender that you need. So one, I point that out because everybody likes to give, natural products a pass, but it's important to point out that endocrine disrupting chemicals can exist in nature. So there are reports of concerns with lavender for children who are exposed to a lot. So meaning like you're using a lavender shampoo or a lavender soap and you're using it every single day. Because remember, children will absorb more based on, their surface area. So using a little bit of lavender, now and then is not going to cause any problems. If you're steeping yourself in lavender every single day, who knows? It's unstudied, but it doesn't sound like that's a concern.
Thank you. Rita is wondering, how might menopause differ for women who have never been pregnant?
So there isn't any difference if you've never been pregnant. So, there's no real link between pregnancy and menopause from that standpoint. There are, though, however, women who are a little bit super fertile, for lack of a better, description. And, they kind of, I have a friend who I swear she said that, her husband puts his pants on the bed and she's pregnant. She's one of those people who literally, the only time they haven't used condoms is when she got pregnant. So there are people who are super fertile like that. And there is a little bit of data that suggests that their menopause might start a bit later. But obviously, if you're super fertile, you probably maybe have, more in reserve with your ovaries from that kind of standpoint. But the actual symptoms or experience of menopause is no different.
Thanks for that. I'm pretty sure you touch on this in the book, but Carrie's wondering, what is your opinion on hormone replacement? Would women benefit from it or experience milder menopause symptoms or remain stronger longer if we supplemented the dwindling hormones?
So that's really not a question that I can answer in this format. Menopausal hormone therapy is something that can help many people, but many people also don't need it. And for some people, it can increase risks of problems. And so it's really important with any therapy to do something that's tailored for you. And I hope that, the information in the book allows, people to make those decisions. Certainly 25% of people really have very minimal symptoms of menopause, and you wouldn't want to take a medication if you have no symptoms. And if you don't have other health concerns that MHC can help, for example, a high risk of osteoporosis, what would be the reason sort of for taking it? So you have to look at a person's overall health and sort of weigh the risks and the benefits. It's a very safe medicine, but again, if you don't need it.
Yeah. Jill is wondering, many women are unaware of how the loss of estrogen affects their urinary tract. Can you share a little more about what happens to the bladder and urethra with menopause? Is continence common? Increased risk of UTIs? ?
Sure. So there's a whole chapter on bladder health in the book. And again, to sum it up, in a couple of sentences isn't really possible. There is an increased risk of urinary tract infections related to low estrogen, and that starts to increase around the age of 60. And using vaginal estrogen is very effective treatment. Actually, using estrogen systemically is not as effective. So that's just kind of something to keep in. You need that kind of like a high dose in the vagina. And so estrogen in the vagina can be very helpful for people who have that. There can also be, other things to do as well. Incontinence per se isn't typically sort of associated with menopause. It's more associated with aging. And I think that's something to keep in mind. And actually, some types of incontinence can actually be made a little bit worse with taking menopausal hormone therapy. And that's not a reason not to do it. It's just a reason to be, to learn about it. And so, but as women age, incontinence becomes a huge problem. And if you look at older women, 75% will have some incontinence, 50% of women in their middle age will have some. So these are significant issues and absolutely need to be addressed. And a lot of the treatments are outlined in the book.
Thanks for that. And we're getting quite a few questions about the same topic, and how might menopause differ if you've always been on the pill? And in particular, people taking the pill premenopausal, can that be cancerous? Should they stay on it? Is there any risk to that?
So yeah, I can't give people medical advice kind of in this sort of format or sort of explain that. But many people take the birth control pill up until their menopause, and that's absolutely fine if you need it for contraception, and it will be controlling symptoms for many people. So, then you have to make a decision about when to stop it, because that dose of estrogen is really too high to continue on long term. Whether it's safe for someone to take that pill in their late 40s will depend on their heart risk factors primarily, right? So not everybody will be able to take that dose of estrogen safely, and some people will. So some people will find that it completely, treats the big symptoms of the menopause transition, and then they can step down to sort of a mid-range dose with menopausal hormone therapy, and then decide if they need to stay on it or not, kind of long-term, depending on their sort of individual factors. But so I think that there's a lot of considerations there.
Thanks for touching on that. And just kind of one last thing about the birth control. A few people are wondering, will that delay menopause for them? Will it have any effect on when they get menopause?
So there is a little bit of data that suggests it might. It might have a slight delay, but it's not definitely that robust. But yeah, there is some data to suggest that it could delay it, because it's sort of basically keeping some of your eggs on ice. But the problem with some of that data is, access to contraception is also linked with socioeconomic status and access to healthcare, and both of those things are also linked with a later menopause.
Great. We have some kind of specific questions, if you're okay with that.
Well, I'll let you know if they.
All right, let's hit it. Okay, so I have been postmenopausal for around 8 to 9 years. I never had bad flushes, but sex was super painful, so I started on estradiol suppositories. It helps a lot, not perfect. I never got a sense of whether this is safe to take for as long as I have been taking it. I'm deathly afraid that if I stop, I will not be able to have intercourse. Should I stop worrying and just continue taking it?
So I can't answer that question because I don't know what product you're using. So if you're using a compounded product, then I would switch to a pharmaceutical, because you may not be getting the dose of estrogen that you think you're getting. If you're using a pharmaceutical and there's only one suppository on the market, and you can't have been using that for 8 or 9 years. So you're either using something else, or you're calling something else a suppository that isn't. So of the pharmaceutical products, there's a wide range in dosing. And so, if you're using, for example, the vaginal estrogen tablet, the dose is really low and might not be enough for everybody. And so you might need to step up to a different dose. And sort of all that information is in the book. If you're using estrogen in the right dose vaginally, then there really are no long-term health consequences from that. It's really very safe. If you're using a compounded product, there is data to show that they can have too much estrogen or too little. And so that could be a problem. So, I think that it would depend on what you're using. Now, there's also other causes of pain with sex. And sometimes people have muscle spasm, and that can be a very common cause. And so seeing a pelvic floor physical therapist who can tell you if that's what's going on as well might be valuable. So it's important to say maybe something else besides estrogen could also be a cofactor.
Great, thank you for that. An anonymous attendee is wondering, are there risks associated with early menopause? I experienced my last period in my early 40s.
So the earlier you have menopause, the greater the risk of health complications related to it. So, and that's related to an increased risk of cardiac disease, a slightly increased risk of dementia, and osteoporosis. So the earlier you have menopause, the increase of those risks. The later you have menopause, the lower the increase with that. The later you have menopause, the lower the risk of breast cancer. So it's these things. The lower the risk of breast cancer. I'm getting it all confused, doing it off the top of my head without a whiteboard. But yeah, so you have an increased risk. And so it's important to, get your screening for heart health, and to, look at your family history of osteoporosis and find out if you should be screened sooner, and to talk about, the potential health implications for you.
Great, thank you. And to end on a random question, do other mammals have menopause?
Great question. And I address that in the book. Yeah. So the only other mammal to have menopause are toothed whales. And we know the most about orcas, or killer whales. And just like with humans, having post-reproductive lifespan increases the survival of your grandchildren or your grandcalves. So that's the grandmother hypothesis that I talk about in the book. And it really, tells us that women in menopause, our ancestral grandmothers, were very, very they had great use to society. So yeah, and it's the same with killer whales. If there's a grandmother, her grand calf is far more likely to survive. And they've even seen in times of low food that the grandmother's sharing their food with their grand calves. Interestingly, with killer whales, the males die at 50.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so thrilled we got you on Pub Day, and all the feedback has been so great. And to all of you listening, yes, an email will go out tomorrow. It will include all the information in the chat, the discount code. I'll also include links to follow Dr. Jen and her website, and hopefully her podcast link, which we'll get in there. Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Jen. Anything you want to say to take us out?
Yeah, so I have a new podcast that's with the TED Audio Collective called Body Stuff with Dr. Jen Gunter. And actually the episode next week is on menopause, but download it today. Last week we looked at the 8 glasses of water a day myth and explained how your kidneys and thirst really work and why you might believe that myth. And our episode that drops tonight at midnight is about poop and about the myth, do you really need to poop once a day?
Interesting. Well, I will be sure to include that then, because I'm sure you'll get lots of interested listeners from tonight. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Dr. Jen. I appreciate you coming, and I hope all of you have a really great evening.
Thank you. Good night. Thanks, everybody.